Generally speaking, I don't spend too much time on any single model. All the infantry units I've painted for this Cryptcast Infernal Force have been finished in less than an hour. Thanks for all the excellent names in the last video, by the way, which is sort of my standard. After that, my brain wants to move on and I have an incredibly difficult time focusing. In fact, I've built entire armies in about 2 hours. My 3 regiments for Turnip 28 were done in little more than 6 hours total. This sort of hour per mini is fine for standard kind of infantry sized models. Anything bigger requires more time. I knew I'd be spending more time on this Lord Vigilant on Griffstalker, the leader of my spearhead army. For this dude, I was working on the hypothesis that making him less like the box art and more like my own interpretation would carry me through the time spent on him. Assembling the Griffstalker, I knew I needed to change up the head. Go with some sort of skull, following the theme of the army. Are they corrupted by chaos? Death? I like the ambiguity. Regardless, my favorite Wargames Atlantic kit, the Skeleton Cavalry Box, coming in clutch once again. After putting the head and neck together, I hacked off the head, leaving the head armor off. Then continuing to remove plastic until the skull fit nicely beneath the armor, trying to maintain more or less the original angle. I knew I'd need to fill in around the skull a bit, but that would wait for the rest of the build to be complete. Most of Lord Vigilant here was pretty on point as far as the vibe I'm going for with this army. All the bird skulls on the armor panels fit right in. I only scraped and cut out a couple of the Griffstalker's armor panels and removed the tall, extra thing behind Lord Vigilant's head and replaced his head with a skull, as you do. With everything assembled, I went back to fixing the neck. After cutting some more material out of the way, I mixed up some green stuff and added a small amount on either side to fill the gap. Once the gap was filled, I used a silicone carving tool and an X-Acto knife to smooth it into place and add some fur texture to match the original sculpt. Although I wouldn't exactly recommend the blade, and I think it turned out alright. After making these relatively minor changes, it was starting to feel more me, I guess, and I was excited to slap on some paint. Starting by hosing everything down in burnt sienna, as I've been doing with this army. Because the airbrush lays down such a thin layer of paint, I was able to add more layers in a zenithal fashion, creating some shadows. Subtle, but definitely there. When painting anything bigger than a standard infantry unit, I like to give myself little wins, set myself up for success, and build momentum. The Griffstalker's fur and feathers made up a large portion of the model, so I started there. To match all the rust I've got going on in this army, I decided to paint the Griffstalker a light jade, almost verdigris color. Beginning by mixing a small amount of the burnt sienna into jade green, I began laying some color down in a pretty sloppy way. I wasn't particularly thorough, and didn't care about having a solid, consistent layer. The splotchiness adds to the end look, at least to me. I then sketched on thin lines running up and down the body with jade green. Again, these were done in an inconsistent fashion, just trying to mimic fur. As I covered less and less surface, I mixed more and more pale yellow, continuing to paint on thin, mostly vertical lines. For the feathers, I added yellow to the jade, giving them some slight differentiation from the rest of the fur. And the brightest highlights were reserved for the head, in an effort to draw the eye upwards. Continuing with the theme of small wins, I moved on to the skulls of both the rider and mount. I stuck with the scheme I worked out with the Vindictors, earth brown and light neutral gray. I really focused on thin lines and dots, working up loads of texture, trying to make these skulls look old, weathered, and worn. These guys have seen some things. As I paint more and more little army mans, and develop this style of mine, or whatever you might call it, I'm realizing that I don't really care about making anything appear realistic. More hyper, or maybe surrealist. Not hyper real, more like my interpretation of what's real. For this metallic armor, I'm vaguely considering the main light direction, but not necessarily secondary bounce reflections. I've mostly got the sharp contrast that exists on shiny surfaces, so it reads as having bright highlights, but not in any realistic way. And that's okay. In fact, it's perfect in its imperfection. I'm beginning to believe we should think like artists when we paint. I'm in no way suggesting that I am an artist. At best, I'm honing a craft. But thinking like an artist means looking at the world around you, taking it in, and creating your version through some medium. For hobbyists, it's our little plastic war dollies. In virtually all of my videos, you'll hear me say I don't blend. And I think that's a big part, or a non-existent part, of my process. It's not right or wrong, it's simply how I've come to approach painting. My primary objective in sharing these little internet videos is to showcase my process, talk through it, reveal my own interpretation of mini painting, and maybe lead you down a path you hadn't considered before. Open your mind to new ways of thinking about painting. Maybe trying something that you thought too difficult because you saw my sloppy interpretation of it in a video. Ultimately, it's to have fun. It's a hobby. It should be fun. Doing it in any way that makes it not fun for you is probably the only way to do it wrong. But don't take my word for it. I'm just a stranger on the internet. Try all the techniques and processes. You'll find little pieces here and there that will be fun for you. And maybe, just maybe, it'll increase your enjoyment of our weird little niche. Okay, that was a lot. Thanks for attending my TED Talk, I guess. Anyways, here's the newest addition to the Cryptcast Infernals. So, did my hypothesis prove true? Well, I was always engaged in having fun painting this dude, and his bird horse, so maybe making things less standard and more custom, or mine as it were, is the way to go. I'm definitely leaning that way. I guess we'll see if that holds true throughout the process of creating this entire army. What about you? Are you by the box or full custom? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, you are awesome. Thanks for watching.